The call came through on a Thursday afternoon, an ordinary Thursday, the kind where I was reviewing resumes at my kitchen table with a cup of coffee going cold beside me. My husband's name lit up my phone, and when I answered, his voice had a strange, rehearsed calm to it. The kind of calm people practice in a mirror before they say something they know will break someone. "I think we both know this marriage has run its course," he said. "I've met someone. I didn't want you to hear it from anyone else." I didn't ask who. I already knew. In the quiet, certain way you know a storm has arrived before the first drop of rain falls. I set my coffee cup down carefully on the table, and I felt something inside me go very still and very cold. My name is Elena Marsh. I'm 44 years old, and I run a boutique staffing and recruitment firm that places senior executives at companies across the state. My entire career has been built on reading people, separating what a resume claims from what a person actually is, spotting the gap between the story someone tells about themselves and the truth sitting quietly underneath it. I built my agency from nothing, working 70-hour weeks in the early years, building it into something that generates millions in revenue annually. I never imagined I'd need those same professional skills inside my own marriage, but by the time Daniel called that Thursday, I was already using every single one of them. Daniel and I met when I was 28, at a networking event where he was pitching his ambitions, and I was already deep into building my own business. He was a junior associate at a marketing firm then, sharp and charming, with the kind of drive that I recognized because I saw it in myself every morning in the mirror. He was 7 years older, which felt significant at the time, established enough to seem stable, young enough to still be hungry. I believed in him before almost anyone else did. When he wanted to leave his firm and start his own consultancy, I was the one who introduced him to half his first clients, who reworked our household budget so he could take the risk, who sat up late with him rewriting pitch decks until they were good enough to win rooms full of skeptical investors. I told myself it was partnership. I told myself that building someone up was its own kind of building, that there was something beautiful in the sacrifice. It took me years to understand that somewhere in all that giving, I had quietly stopped building anything of my own. The trajectory I'd been on, the growth I'd been charting for my agency, all of that got smaller and quieter as Daniel's needs took up more and more space. Those early years were not easy ones, though at the time I never would have described them that way. We lived in a cramped 2-bedroom apartment above a hardware store, and I remember doing our laundry at a laundromat 3 blocks away because we couldn't justify the cost of an in-unit machine on top of Daniel's business expenses. I picked up freelance recruiting contracts on the side, on top of my full-time role, just to cover the gap between what his consultancy was bringing in and what our life actually cost. I told myself it was temporary, the way you tell yourself most sacrifices are temporary when you love someone and believe in what you're building together. There were nights I sat at our kitchen table until 1 or 2 in the morning, reworking his pitch decks after a full day at my own job, because he said my instincts for how a room would react to a proposal were sharper than his. He'd put his hand on my shoulder and say, "You always know exactly what people need to hear." I believed that was a kind of partnership. I believed that if I kept lending him my judgment, my time, my late nights, it would eventually come back around in some equal measure, the way water finds its own level if you're patient enough. It took me the better part of a decade to notice that the measuring had only ever gone one direction. By the time his consultancy was steady enough to stand on its own, I had quietly let go of an offer to join a much larger firm, one that would have doubled my salary and put me on a partner track within 5 years. Daniel needed me flexible during that stretch, he said, needed someone at home who understood his hours, who could step in for calls with nervous early clients when he was stuck in traffic or between meetings. I never resented the choice at the time. I only understood much later that a marriage can quietly become a ledger where only one person is required to keep making entries. Ashley started at Daniel's company as a marketing coordinator 2 years ago, 26 years old, sharp, endlessly complimentary of Daniel, in the way young employees sometimes are with bosses they admire. My closest friend, Rachel, met her once at a company holiday party and told me afterward that Ashley seemed a little too comfortable around Daniel. I remember that phrase exactly, 'cause it stuck with me, but I brushed it off. Rachel had a habit of reading too much into things, I told myself. I never once considered that the people closest to us sometimes see the truth long before we're ready to let ourselves see it. I noticed small changes over the following months, the kind that are easy to explain away individually and only add up to something when you look back at them as a whole. Daniel started working later, always with a reasonable explanation attached. He became more particular about his appearance before ordinary Tuesday meetings. He mentioned Ashley's name more than he mentioned anyone else on his team, always framed as praise for her work ethic, her instincts, her ambition. I told myself I recognized ambition because I had spent years admiring the same quality in him. I didn't yet understand that he was describing someone he'd started to see the way he used to see me, back when I was the 28-year-old who believed in him before anyone else did. The day Daniel called to end our marriage, I didn't cry. I didn't ask him to reconsider or plead with him to work things out. I said, "All right," and hung up the phone. And I sat at my kitchen table for a long time, simply breathing, feeling the strange clarity that comes when something you've suspected for months suddenly becomes confirmed fact. That night, I did what I do best. I opened my laptop and started pulling together everything I needed. Not to fight him, not yet, but to understand exactly what I was dealing with. 15 years of my career had taught me one inviolable rule. You never confront a story until you've verified every piece of it. You gather everything first, quietly, before anyone knows you're looking. You build an unassailable case before you ever let the other person know you've been investigating. I started with the joint accounts. Buried among the ordinary expenses, I found a pattern of transfers to a separate account I didn't recognize, small and steady over the past year, the kind of amount that wouldn't draw attention unless you were specifically looking for it. I cross-referenced the dates against Daniel's calendar, the one I still had access to from years of managing his schedule. The transfers had started almost exactly when Ashley joined his company. People who are confident they'll never get caught stop being careful. Daniel had spent 15 years building a reputation as a steady, devoted husband, someone who'd credit me publicly for his early success in every interview he gave. Maintaining that image required consistency, and consistency leaves a trail if you know where to look. What I found next didn't fit the story I'd already built in my head. The transfers weren't going to Ashley directly. They were going to a holding account linked to a name I didn't recognize at first, Marcus Reyes, until I remembered exactly who that was. Ashley's father, a venture investor Daniel had been quietly courting for over a year to fund an expansion of his consultancy. I pulled every email I could find referencing Reyes, going back nearly 18 months, still logged into an old shared drive from years earlier that Daniel had never thought to close off. The early messages were exactly what I expected: cautious introductions, a lunch meeting here, a proposal draft there. But the tone shifted noticeably around the same point Ashley had joined the company, becoming warmer, more familiar, filled with the kind of casual confidence that comes from a relationship deepening beyond simple business. Reyes had started referring to Daniel, in one email to another investor, as practically family already. At the time I found it, I had no idea how literally he meant that. I sat with that information for a long time before it made sense. Daniel hadn't simply fallen for a younger woman. He'd fallen into something far more calculated, and I wasn't sure yet whether he understood that himself. Or perhaps he did, and he just didn't care. Perhaps the money mattered more to him than the means of getting it. It was Rachel who called me 2 weeks later, her voice tight in a way I'd rarely heard from her. "Elena," she said, "I need to tell you something, and I should have told you a long time ago." We met at a small cafe near my office, the kind of place we'd been to a dozen times before, for easy, uncomplicated conversations. This time, Rachel was already seated when I arrived, her hands wrapped so tightly around her cup that her knuckles had gone pale, and she didn't look up until I pulled out the chair across from her. "What I'm about to tell you," she said, "I've known for almost a year, and I've regretted staying quiet about it every single day since." I didn't say anything, Silence is often the fastest way to get someone to keep talking, and in my business, silence is a tool I've perfected over decades. Rachel told me that Marcus Reyes hadn't simply become interested in Daniel's company by chance. He'd been introduced to Daniel specifically, through Ashley, as part of an arrangement neither of us had ever been told about. Reyes wanted access to a mid-size consultancy with an established client list and a strong reputation to fold into a larger firm he was quietly building across 3 states. Ashley's closeness to Daniel wasn't only personal, it had been encouraged, almost engineered, because it gave her father leverage he wouldn't have had otherwise. "Does Daniel know any of this?" I asked, because that was the question sitting heaviest on my chest. If he'd walked away from 15 years of marriage for something built on a lie he didn't even understand, I wasn't sure how to feel about that. It was one thing to have your partner betray you, it was another thing entirely to have him betray you for something that was itself a betrayal. Rachel shook her head. "I don't think so. I think he genuinely believes this is about her. I think he has no idea what her father actually wants out of this arrangement. Ashley didn't even tell him." I thought about every transfer I'd already traced, every quiet inconsistency I'd assumed was simple infatuation. I had believed I understood the full shape of my marriage's ending. Sitting across from Rachel, I realized I'd only been looking at the surface of something much larger and much more calculated. I didn't confront Daniel. Instead, I called an old contact of mine, a business attorney named Patricia Wynn who specialized in exactly this kind of quiet due diligence, and I asked her to help me understand precisely what Marcus Reyes was building and what role Daniel's company played in it. Patricia had worked on several high-profile cases involving corporate acquisitions and hidden business arrangements. 2 weeks later, she handed me a file thicker than I expected, documenting a pattern of similar acquisitions Reyes had made over the years, always through a personal relationship, always engineered by introducing an attractive young woman to the target, always ending the same way. The founder pushed out once the client list and contracts had been absorbed into Reyes's larger firm. Daniel wasn't the architect of his own new beginning. He was, in the clearest and coldest sense, being used. And he'd been willing to destroy his marriage to walk into it. I didn't warn him. Some part of me, in those early weeks, still wanted to. I imagined calling him, telling him what I'd discovered, giving him the chance to make a different choice. But another part of me, quieter and more certain, understood that this wasn't my responsibility to prevent. I had spent 15 years absorbing consequences that weren't mine to carry, making myself smaller so he could be larger. I wasn't going to volunteer for one more act of self-sacrifice, even if it was framed as saving him from himself. It was Daniel's mother, Carol, who called me nearly 2 months later, her voice unsteady in a way I'd never heard from her before. "Elena," she said, "I think something's happened with Daniel's company. He won't tell me the details, he just keeps saying it's complicated. I found out the rest secondhand, the way these things often surface, pieced together from a conversation Carol had with Daniel one evening, which she later described to me in careful, pained detail over coffee at our usual spot. Daniel had gone to Reyes's office expecting to finalize the expansion deal they'd been discussing for months. Instead, Reyes informed him, without much ceremony or pretense of gentleness, that the acquisition would proceed, but Daniel's role in the new structure would be significantly reduced, a consulting position, not the leadership role he'd been promised. Ashley, Carol said, was in the room when it happened, and she didn't say a word in Daniel's defense. She didn't even look surprised. Carol told me Daniel sat in stunned silence for a long moment before finally asking, "This was never about the relationship, was it?" Reyes, according to Carol's account, simply said, "It was about both. Ashley likes you. That was never a lie. But I don't build partnerships around feelings. I build them around what works." Daniel came home that night, if you could call the apartment he'd moved into a home, and told his mother everything. The consultancy he'd built over a decade, the one I'd helped him launch by introducing him to his first clients, was no longer his to run. He'd lost control of his own company. Ashley remained loyal to her father, not to him. She'd already moved on to the next project, the next target. Whatever future he'd imagined for himself when he called me on that ordinary Thursday afternoon had quietly dissolved into something much smaller than he'd bargained for. Daniel showed up at my house a week after that, something I hadn't expected and didn't particularly want. I opened the door because avoiding him would have felt like giving the moment more power than it deserved, and by then I'd learned that the best way to take power back was to control the terms of the conversation. "I made a mistake," he said, before I'd even fully opened the door. "Elena, I know how that sounds, but I need you to understand what happened." "I already know what happened," I said, my voice steady in a way that seemed to unsettle him. "All of it." He looked at me for a long moment, something shifting behind his eyes. The moment when he realized I wasn't going to be the audience he'd hoped for. "How?" "The same way I learned everything else in my career," I said. "I looked, I investigated, I didn't accept the story you were telling and assume it was true. I did what I should have been doing all along. I verified the facts before I drew any conclusions." He didn't have a response for that. I let him stand there a moment longer, watching him process the realization that I'd seen exactly what was happening, long before he'd even admitted it to himself. "I understand what happened to you, Daniel," I said finally. "I even feel for you, a little, because I don't think you saw any of it coming. But understanding why something happened isn't the same as wanting it back. You didn't just get manipulated by Reyes and Ashley. You made a choice to walk away from 15 years to chase something you thought would make you feel bigger and more important than you were. The manipulation explains part of your pain. It doesn't erase the choice you made." He didn't argue. I watched something in him accept it, the way people do when an explanation they've rehearsed the whole drive over stops holding up once it's spoken aloud and reflected back to them. The divorce finalized quietly a few months later. The process was professional and clean because I insisted on it. I asked for nothing beyond what was fair, because by then, fairness had already done more work than any settlement could. My attorney had wanted me to push harder, pointing out that I'd have solid grounds to argue for a significantly larger share, given how much of my own income and career momentum had gone toward building his consultancy in its earliest years. She presented me with calculations, showing exactly how much I'd sacrificed. "I could make him pay for that," she said. But I declined. I didn't want a number attached to what those years had cost me. Some debts aren't the kind a settlement can actually repay, and I'd rather walk away with a clean ledger than spend another year arguing over one. What I wanted was closure, not vindication. Daniel moved into a smaller apartment across town. I heard through mutual acquaintances that the consulting role Reyes had offered him lasted less than a year before Daniel was pushed out entirely, his name slowly erased from the firm he'd once built. Ashley, from what Carol told me later, stayed with her father's company rather than with Daniel once the restructuring was complete. She was already working on the next acquisition, already positioning herself to help identify and seduce the next target. Whatever she'd felt for Daniel, it apparently hadn't been enough to outweigh her own position within her father's world. I spent that first year after the divorce doing what I've always done best. I grew my agency. What had been a successful firm with a handful of steady clients became something larger, something known specifically for placing executives who'd been overlooked or underestimated elsewhere. People who needed someone willing to look past a resume's surface and find what was actually there. My company had grown enough that I'd stopped personally reviewing every application that came through my system, until one Tuesday morning, when a resume landed on my desk for a mid-level operations position, forwarded by my hiring manager with a note that simply said, "Strong background, thought you'd want to see this one yourself." I recognized the name before I finished reading the first line. I sat with it for a long moment, the way you sit with something that asks you to decide, all over again, who you're going to be. I could have passed the file along without comment. I could have quietly instructed my team to move on to other candidates. I could have told my hiring manager to handle it without involving me. Instead, I did what I've always done. I looked at the facts in front of me, without the noise of anger or old grief attached to them. His experience was genuine. his skills matched the role. Whatever had happened between us belonged to a version of my life I had already closed the book on, and I found, sitting there with his resume in my hands, that I meant that more completely than I expected to. I let the process run exactly as it would have for any other candidate. He interviewed with my hiring manager first, then with 2 members of my leadership team, and by the time he reached the final round, he still didn't know whose name was on the door of the office he was walking into. My hiring manager mentioned afterward that he'd interviewed well, thoughtful about his answers, honest in a way that surprised her about a gap in his employment history he could easily have glossed over. She had no idea, reading his file, exactly whose gap she was reading about. I watched him settle into the chair across from my desk, the same easy posture I remembered from 15 years of marriage, though something in it had gone quieter, more careful, the posture of a man who had learned the hard way what it costs to assume you'll always land on your feet. His expression, when he finally looked up and realized who was sitting across from him, was the only unguarded moment of the entire interview. For a second, maybe less, I saw him process it, the shock, the calculation, the moment when he understood what this meant. "Elena," he said quietly. "Daniel," I said, and I meant it evenly, without any weight behind it one way or the other. "Your file is strong. I'll let the team finish their process the way we would for anyone else." He didn't ask for anything more than that, and I respected him a little for it. We didn't discuss the past. We didn't need to. 2 weeks later, my hiring manager offered him the position based purely on merit, and he accepted it the same way any other candidate would have, and started the following month. I think about those 15 years often now, not with bitterness, but with a strange, settled kind of clarity about the woman they eventually made me. I spent so long believing my worth was tied to how much I could give someone else's ambitions before I understood that building something entirely my own was the only foundation that was ever going to hold. I think, too, about all those late nights rewriting decks at our kitchen table, believing I was investing in something shared. In a strange way, I suppose I was. I just didn't know yet that the thing I was really practicing, all those years, was exactly the skill I would eventually need to build a life without him, the ability to read situations clearly, to separate what people claim from what they actually do, to trust evidence over emotion. Sometimes the greatest act of self-preservation isn't making someone suffer for what they did, it's building a life so complete and so entirely your own that their choices no longer have the power to define it. It's being so secure in who you are that you can hire your ex-husband and treat him with professional courtesy, not because you've forgiven him, but because you've moved so far beyond him that forgiveness becomes irrelevant. If you've made it this far with me, I want to know what you think. Do you think Elena and Daniel can simply coexist as colleagues, or do you think this arrangement won't last? Do you think she made the right choice in hiring him, or do you think she's playing with fire? Leave a comment and let me know where you're watching from tonight. If you enjoyed this story, we have so many more like it waiting for you, so make sure you subscribe so you never miss the next one.